have a talk with John Collins from Elevator Repair Service, who's here just doing a little reconnaissance visit here at the Arts Center. And we thought it was a great opportunity when he's here, not involved in a production, but just to get to know the community a little bit, to kind of share his experience as a director and as the leader of a theater company that has kind of had a great deal of success both locally and throughout the world. And so we're very happy that Deborah Williams, the head of the literature program here at NYUED, is here to kind of interview and then open it up to some questions, and we welcome all of our audience who's watching on the live stream as well. Thanks.
Thanks.
John.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
Nice to be here. The live stream idea has now completely freaked me out, so I just wish you hadn't said that, Bill, but thank you. So I'm also, it's the literature and creative writing program, which I know Roland knows, right? So we're both, right? We're not just books, we're not just writing, we do both things. And when I was looking at your bio, it warmed my heart because John has a degree from Yale in English literature and theater, right? So I have a sign outside my office that says, what can you do with an English major? And then there's a picture of Justin Trudeau, who was an English major. And then you can also become the director of a theater company, of a long-running theater company, which is kind of an amazing thing in New York, right? Where it's very difficult to keep a repertory company and a making art company stay alive for this long. So my first question is really whether you could talk a little bit about that decision to be English and theater back in the day, which was, very recently that you got out of college. Because our students sometimes think that what you do in college is what you're going to do for the rest of your life. And in your case, it maybe has borne out that way. But
eventually,
so maybe you could talk a little bit just about that path.
Yeah. Well, I think, going back to high school even, studying literature was more than just studying literature. It was my studying English overlapped with a lot of other things that I love to do. Like writing was folded in there, and theater was folded in there, and it was so it always felt to me like a discipline that was expansive, and it touched on a lot of different things that I was interested in doing, and just ways I was interested in spending my time. So it was natural in a way to choose English as a major in school. Now, I mean, with the caveat that when you're 17 or 18 years old, I don't think anybody should be expected to really understand what they're going to be doing for the rest of their life. But it seemed like a good choice that way, insofar as, reading and writing help you learn to think. And there's nothing that's not valuable for. The theater part of it was more just the thing I loved doing. That was almost the fun part, although, which is not to say the English part was not fun also, but that was a specific thing I knew I wanted to pursue. But they talk to each other so well. So, to me it was a kind of expansive way of looking at what to study. And, it's hard to draw, absolutely direct, bright lines to, how I started my career, but like I said, studying literature is a way of learning how to think, learning how to be analytical, and learning how to read, and that's something that you never stop using.
I think that sounds like things I say. I love that. Thank you. Can you talk? I'm curious about. You said that you were always writing. So you were writing. Were you writing plays? Were you writing kind of anything you could? Were you also, because you're a director now primarily? So are you also? Have you been? Are you still also an actor and a writer of drama?
Well, I figured out at some point, towards the end of my college years that directing was the thing I was probably best at. I did a lot of acting in school, and once in a while I do it now, usually to fill in for someone who's had to leave one of my shows. But it's not, I don't think of that as my passion at all. And writing was something that I did, when I was younger. It was the way that I could work out ideas that I had. I like to write short stories, and I think it was incredibly good for me that I did that. But I apply that very differently now. What I do with my company now, I've come to think of as a form of collective writing. I don't write plays, and I don't write text that we use in our shows, because that's not how we develop our shows. And I can talk more about that, but we assemble our work. I guess one way of saying it is sort of using a theatrical vocabulary rather than a literary vocabulary. Now, that theatrical vocabulary includes text. Text is part of a theatrical vocabulary, but so is dance and movement and design and dealing with experience and time for an audience. But like I say, I've come to understand over time that the way we compose our shows is in fact a form of writing, and it goes through a sort of similar iterative process, and we make drafts, and we edit, and we work as a kind of collective writer that way.
I would like to come back to that, because I'm interested in the difference between collective and collaborative, which are synonymous but not necessarily the same. But I'm wondering, particularly for the people who are sitting here, if you could maybe trace the path from college and acting and discovering maybe directing is really sort of your jam, as it were, and what happens to get somebody to decide, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start a theater company, because that's super practical, right? So maybe you could sort of map that journey for people a little bit.
Well, I will say that starting a theater company was something that I did. I consider us to have begun in 1991, which is when I had just graduated from college, and I think, if you were to just take that year in isolation, or those 4 or 5 months that I had just moved to New York and I was starting a theater company, it would be laughable in some ways. There was no institutional infrastructure for anything we were doing. There was not any money. There was no office. There was just a small group of people who had that aspiration. So the idea of a theater company was just sort of purely aspirational at that point. It was a thing we sort of dreamed of being, and that we dared to call ourselves at that point. So in a certain sense, it wasn't practical at all. That came much later. What we were doing, though, was we were setting ourselves on a sort of trajectory and modeling ourselves after some other companies that we admired, and in particular the Wooster Group. And I had sort of adopted this idea from them and from what I had read of them. And I had seen a couple of their shows, and they were sort of life-changing for me. I was seeing theater made in a way that I had never imagined you could make theater. There was a book called Breaking Rules by David Savrin that I read. It chronicled, I guess, about the first 11 or 12 years of the Wooster Group's history. And it's a great book because it's full of interviews with the members of the company and some very deep dives on the ideas behind what they're doing, and also just a good recounting of how they made some of their shows. And it completely appealed to me. It thrilled me, actually, to read about a group of people that made work entirely collaboratively. And I don't just mean once it came time to deciding how to stage a script. they made their plays entirely from the ground up as a company. It seemed to me there would be a sort of security in that. I mean, it appealed to my desire to be sort of working in a small, insular group. I mean, in a way, not having to be real professional about it. You know, there was something about it, like, you know, it seemed like a great little club that they had formed, and there was a kind of safety in that they could take risks and try things. And so that was a kind of professional environment I wanted to exist in. It was a social environment I wanted to exist in. So we started, you know, with this idea that you could actually make great work that took interesting risks and was original and new by working in with a small, close-knit group. So that was how it started. Was it sort of? I mean, I was even nervous about putting a name on the company then, and then we, you know, especially because the name we had chosen was so absurd already at that point.
Have you always been the elevator repair service?
Yeah, we've always been called Elevator Repair Service, which.
Could you
yes.
perhaps talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of a running joke between James Hanahan and me. James was another one of the founders of the company, and James is now primarily a writer. He's a terrific writer. But I was visiting a relative when I was about 11 years old who was at work. She was my aunt. She was developing a survey that was going to be used for unemployed adults to help them figure out what would be a good job for them to apply for. And my cousin and I took the test. It was on a computer, you know, which at the time was like a gigantic,
ginormous,
it was
right?
a printer with a keyboard on it. It was like a giant typewriter almost. But it asked you all these questions about what you like to do for work. You know. Really simple questions like, do you enjoy working with your hands? Do you like working with technology? You know, would you prefer to work alone or with a group of people? I answered all those questions very honestly, and you got a short list of choices as to what you should probably apply for in a job, and one of mine was elevator repairman. So James and I used to joke that, you know, if we started a theater company, we'd have to call it Elevator Repair Service, so we'd make that come true.
There you go.
And
see,
yeah.
those and they say those tests are silly. You see, so it all comes to pass. Take those Facebook quizzes, I think, is really where we want to go there.
Or no, don't use third-party apps on Facebook.
They're going to mine your data, like,
Yeah.
oh my goodness. So can you talk a little bit, so in that sort of struggling era of being elevator repair people with a twist, how did you said it didn't, you know, how does it go from that fledgling idea, we can build it in the barn, we can do this, and you know, it's a secret club and it sounds really exciting. And now you are this sort of international, shall we say, group, and with work that just looks fascinating and funny and interesting. And I want to come back to the work, but I'm still still interested in this process of development.
I think one thing that's important to say about that, I mean, it was aspirational insofar as we hoped to be seen as a sort of strong collective of artists that way, but it wasn't ambitious. And I think that's important because I think one of the best things we did for ourselves early on was not we didn't have any need for a certain kind of success.
Right.
We were perfectly happy to work with no money. I think I wanted us to have a space to work, and after about a year, we got a couple of us rented a loft that had a big open space where we could rehearse. But we didn't ask the company as it was then to pay for that. We were really happy just making some work, and you know, I think a lot of young companies get tripped up when they decide they can't really go forward unless they're raising a lot of money and they have an office and they have a manager, managing director, a lot of sort of administrative infrastructure around what they're doing, because that does seem to confer legitimacy on whatever you're doing. We just didn't need that. And for several years, we were just subsisting on our enjoyment of the work we were doing. And, we were accommodating a group of actors and writers and directors who had other jobs.
Right, that's what I was going to add.
We worked at night, we worked on the weekends, and I think partly because the work we were doing was, and any kind of theater work, is very social in nature. We enjoyed leaving those office jobs or whatever we had to pay the bills to come and get together and play.
Right.
So it was fulfilling that way, just as a way to spend our time. And so we managed to develop something of a reputation as a group before we ever applied for a grant, or we'd have a fundraising party every now and then. We'd have 150 people over to our loft and charge them $12 at the door, and that would be enough money to help pay for one of our very cheap shows. I mean, everything we did then was informed by that condition, and our aesthetic kind of emerged from our not needing a lot of money to do anything that we did. And that continues today. I mean, we do spend money on things now, and mostly on people, so that we can provide day jobs to people like me and other people on my staff. But it was a key to our success in building an organization that we didn't try to build an organization when we started out.
Would you say, because I'm thinking about New York now, and the idea of let's get together and rent a loft is, if you stretch the boundaries of New York to being, I don't know, sort of Western Pennsylvania, you can maybe do that sort of thing. Yeah. So I'm wondering if that free space, in a sense, or that is actually the internet, right, where you can do a thing and put it out there so people can see it without all the overhead or without a lot of money. So I just don't know, because I wonder sometimes if that sort of crucible of coming together and it being collective and playful, and you work in your office job, I wonder, sadly, if maybe that's not possible.
I don't know. I wonder the same thing. I mean, the real estate in New York City and just space to physical space.
Right, exactly.
The cost of it has outpaced inflation. So I don't know. I don't know how people do it now, but I think people still have those same impulses.
Yes.
We have younger people work for us as interns, and we teach workshops where we meet a lot of younger people, and I've done some work at NYU, and with graduating seniors, and that same impulse is still there, and I do think information technology and the internet have changed some of those dynamics for sure, but I don't think the internet as a virtual space can replace physical space, because this is a medium of physical space, of actual liveness, not live streamingness. So it's good for things like this. But no, I think that. So I don't really know. I mean, there are so many other things that change as well. I mean, it's very hard to compare the development of a form like live performance in one era versus another. I mean, technology is a huge thing that has changed, especially lately. But but this is about culture as well. This is about what's on, and also just the history of the medium. I was very influenced in the late '80s by work that had been made in the '70s and '80s. And I suspect that what younger people now see and get excited by are different than the things that I saw and got excited by. So that has a lot to do with how people choose to do this.
Can you come back to this idea of collective and collaborative? I'm curious about, because the idea of trying to make something with a group makes me really unhappy. Just like, oh my God.
Well, I mean, there's a sort
So
of...
collective is not collaborative, but it is collaborative. But
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the term collective almost implies something a little bit utopian, and I think that the idea that I think it's a bit of a myth that you can really make anything by just making everybody exactly equal across, a group of people who are trying to make something together. I mean, what we had learned of our medium from studying conventional forms of it is that there are roles, there are hierarchies, and we subscribe to many of those. But I think there's a kind of decision-making process that we strive for that's built around consensus, and consensus is different from say talking about pure democracy or something in this kind of work. We don't take votes on things, and I do have a responsibility to lead the company in my role as director. I put ideas out there. I try to give the company opportunities to think of things that I wouldn't have thought of. And then, because we're a group of people who work together a lot and we're familiar with each other and we know each other, we have developed a way of sensing collectively when an idea is taking hold.
Right. There's
And-
kind of trust there.
Yeah, there's a kind of trust we've developed, and that means, it's not a perfect system. I mean, there's a lot of times we will cling to an idea that's not working because we all want it to work so much, and then we have to toss it out. Or one person, or even I sometimes will be, fiercely devoted to an idea that's not taking with everyone else, and it might mean we waste a little time on that. But ultimately, our sense of being a collective means that we trust a sort of consensus view of how things are going. We try to develop a sense of when we're getting to that.
Right.
And and a lot of times with us, that's, the gauge we use is just humor. If people are enjoying themselves in a certain way, if the group is laughing at something, then, or about doing something, then that's usually a good indication that the energy is there behind the idea.
Right.
Collaboration is something, I think, a little more generally that's just a requirement of working in a medium that involves the work of many different artists. And there are a lot of different ways to collaborate. You can collaborate on something where there's just a single person with all the ideas.
Right. Yeah.
I've never wanted to be that person. So I rely on this ensemble that I work with to generate ideas and material that I couldn't have thought of, and that I can then respond to.
Before, I have one other question before we sort of ask people here. I noticed in going through your work that it's a pretty even balance between building off an existing text, The Sun Also Rises, Measure for Measure, Great Gatsby, and things that look like they were created mostly without an existing text, right? It's the Marx Brothers and something, I can't remember.
It was called the Marx Brothers on Horseback Salad.
Which I believe is probably not an existing text necessarily, but horse feathers.
Well, the idea there was to stage a screenplay that Salvador Dali had written for the Marx Brothers, which was a real thing, but it turns out the project never happened. So what we thought we would find, this wild screenplay that Dali had written for the Marx Brothers, we ended up just creating our show out of a lot of research that we did trying to find it. I mean, it was a very successful failure in that way.
Can you talk a little bit about those choices between existing text,
Yeah, I mean, we came to it was The Great Gatsby was really the first text that we treated with that kind of sort of extreme fealty. But the idea behind our work is to create through rehearsal. And so whether or not there's a text that exists or not, it's the process that generates the show is going to be what we do in rehearsal on our feet. And what we always prefer to have is some kind of difficult or even seemingly impossible problem to solve. And we didn't, and so we've always avoided, not exclusively, but almost always avoided dramatic texts, texts written to be on stage, because they don't present enough of a problem to us. A play that has been written in a theatrical language, just dialogue, stage directions, doesn't give us anything to translate into theatrical language. And that's what we're most interested in. So,
although you did the Virginia Woolf, right? And you directed
the thing we're doing in the yes, that is an exception. That's something written by someone in the company. Everyone's fine with Virginia Woolf. Yeah, I mean, that's another conversation. But we are always. I think to continue to exist and move forward, we always have to be questioning everything about our own assumptions of what we do. So we're often doing things that are the opposite of what I say we do, because that's the only way to keep a fresh perspective on our work. But generally, though, we like to have a problem to solve, and so we turn to text in novels, not because we thought text would make it easier for us or would be more appropriate or conventional, but because the novels and their form presented a tremendous problem for theater makers. And we had to figure out a way to work our way out of that.
I love that idea of the problem, and thinking about that as the thing that moves us forward. I wonder if we want to, if people have questions or want to comment on anything. Yeah. I know I've met you, but I can't remember your name. What's your name?
Abda.
Abda, yes.
Hi, I'm Abda. I'm currently a senior here at NYU Abu Dhabi. Thank you for coming to speak with us today. My question was, when you spoke about the Breaking Rules book by David, what was the idea that gave you the aha moment of, I want to do this?
Yeah, that's a good question. See how much I can narrow this down. It was, I think, in particular, his description of how he made a particular show of theirs. It was a show called Rumstick Road, and this is when the actor and monologuist Spalding Gray was a founding member of the Wooster Group, and they made most of their shows then around his autobiographical monologues. And in the description of one particular part of that show, there was he was talking about a really difficult period in his life. I think he was talking about his mother's suicide, and the description of the various elements involved in this one scene. There was a slide projector, I think, projecting an image of a different face onto someone else's face. There was talk of like music and sound happening, and there was a kind of big theatrical climax in the scene, as I read it described, because I never saw the show, where someone screams and he knocks somebody off the chair or something. I can't remember exactly what happened, but the image of it was this very exciting and almost a little bit scary theatrical moment, sort of purely theatrical moment that had been composed partly out of a text, partly out of someone's personal experience. It partly came from the design, from the sound. And I had this image, I think, reading that, of all of these things coming together to create something, a kind of startling and very real image on stage. And that really stuck with me. And reading the book and understanding sort of how this company had arrived at that theatrical moment, was really convincing. I saw sort of simultaneously some thrilling work being created, but I also saw it being created not because of one single person's great genius, that it was something that happened that they found working together. and that also really appealed to me. And the idea that you didn't have to be, you know, a singular genius with singular great ideas to do this, but that this was something that could be found through a group working together was tremendously inspiring. I mean, you know, nobody's ever asked me that before, and I think that specific moment in that book was when it really clicked for me.
So you mentioned a lot of your ideas coming from collaborative work. I'm just wondering, as a director, how do you make the decision when each of you have such variation in your aesthetic taste?
Well, there's two things. First of all, we come together with a sort of understanding that we share a lot in common as far as our aesthetic taste. I mean, these are different people, and so as much as we share tastes and to some extent we share goals in terms of how we want our work to be seen by an audience. You know, I think of these performers that I work with as sort of absolute conditions of the work that I make, meaning that I don't ever feel the need to try to force one actor's performance to be completely in line aesthetically with another actor's performance. In some sense, the work that we make is the result of all of these different things coming together. So the differences among the different people, you know, help shape the show. There's a kind of eclectic quality of the work that comes from this combination of people who both know each other really well, can work together really well, but who also have very individual styles. I mean, sometimes it's something people note about the work, sometimes, that there are a lot of different styles going on here. And I think, you know, part of my job is to make sure that they can all talk to each other, that those styles talk to each other and those people, and produce something, and that I can synthesize something from all that. But that's kind of what it is. It's about a kind of synthesis from all the different styles rather than trying to smooth them out.
I'm going to add something here, which is this idea of working towards consensus or with consensus, and yet not with everybody being exactly equal, and you do have a position as director. And I was talking with a student who'd done her first time directing, and it was a school production, and she said, you know, I was directing people, and I had to choose, and it felt weird because they were also my friends. But then sometimes I had to say, you know, no, right? And so how does that happen? I mean, consensus is this idea sometimes that nobody ever says no, nobody's ever disappointed. But I'm not sure that that's...
People say no to me all the time.
So I'm curious about consensus.
Well, it's kind of a messy business, you know. It's not perfect that way. And I think that, you know, this goes back to how we began when the stakes were a lot lower. You know, I think people were early on. I mean, the composition of the group has changed a lot, almost entirely since 26 years ago. But anybody who's involved is usually involved for a long stretch of time. So there's a kind of that trust kind of builds up, and I think that that trust is rooted in those early experiences where we were just trying things, and it was fine if we failed. You know, that we had a great freedom to fail early on, and we try to hold on to that in a way. You know, that so in that sense, you know, I'm not comfortable with when the level of disagreement gets too high. I just don't feel comfortable doing my job. So there's a lot of compromising in a way, but it's not compromise in the sense of, you know, we just do half of everybody's idea. It's more synthesis than compromise.
Questions?
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about the rehearsal process, especially since you're working over longer periods of time? So imagine there are points of time where you don't work. What happens in between that time? What happens when you return to the?
Well, first of all, taking time off in between work periods was something we happened on early on because we got the opportunity to remount some of our earlier shows a few months later, and that's when we realized, oh, that first performance was really just a first draft. There's more to do. So each, and at the time, 20 years ago, when we took time off in between, it was so that everybody could have time for their other jobs, or nowadays we still do that because it's really helpful to get some distance on the work you've made. Because to make this kind of work, it requires all of us, and especially me, to be a really good critic of myself. You know, I have to be very hard on myself. I have to constantly learn that lesson over and over again, that, you know, I have to be my own toughest critic, and it helps to take time away to do that. You feel a little less precious, a little less attached to some ideas, to the ideas that aren't working. But as for process, I think what we try to do, we start from scratch every time. We start from nothing. So what that means is that really one of the first things that we're doing is looking for a set of rules to emerge about that piece. And that also means that a sort of process has to emerge that is specific to that material that we're doing. You know, for example, a lot of the way we worked on Measure for Measure recently was to make decisions about how fast or how slow different scenes would go. And so the process, and the actors were reading from teleprompter screens. We had software that one of the actors had written to help us control how fast or slowly the text moved. And so the process there was all about making decisions about speed and how that would dramaturgically inform the text and how that would tell the story. There's an early period where we're just trying to come up with anything that we can stage, trying to figure out trying to identify what the style of the piece is going to be, what are going to sort of be the governing rules, what the universe this play is going to live in. And we try to make that a different universe every time. So I don't go into any piece with an idea about what the process is going to be. I imagine if somebody observing from the outside might be able to better answer that question, just because they might recognize those things that we do the same every time. I'm so focused on making sure we do things differently every time that I tend not to notice what we do the same. But that's good in a way. I mean, I think if we do some things the same every time, I don't know, I guess every show starts in a way with us sitting around a table and just trying to get some ideas out of what we'd like to see happen on stage. And then it'll really depend on the demands of the piece, Sometimes we'll have to spend a lot more time working on a particular section because it's just a lot harder to learn the sequence of actions. But I don't have a repeatable process. I might have a process I inadvertently, accidentally repeat, but I don't do it on purpose.
So, if you think back your college days or right after college, what are the things that you feel grateful that you have done, and what are the things you think you should have done?
That's a good question. Well, one thing that I'm grateful for is that, first, I had a small number of people around me right after college, and a few of whom I had worked with in college. So I had that little bit of history with them. But I had those people that I could start just playing with, that I could start experimenting with. And so there was some safety in having a few people around who I trusted and who trusted me. That and within that sort of safe zone, we could try things. You know? And that was the thing I'm grateful to have had. Another thing that was very important to me was that because I also had an interest in design, and in particular in sound design, I got the opportunity to work with other companies, not as a director, not as someone with any kind of, you know, leadership role or authority, but I got to be a designer and a technician and work on other productions. And that was huge because, like, the Wooster Group that I had admired so much was a company I got to work for a long time. And I got to be in the room while the director of that company was doing her work, and to be able to watch her and just sort of experience through and learn through osmosis. And it wasn't just her. There were a few other companies that Richard Foreman's work I got to participate in, a company called Target Margin Theater I got to work with. And that did a number of things for me as a young adult. I met a lot of people, and that was really important, you know, because, you know, of course I met a lot of people in college too, but after we graduated, you know, people dispersed a little bit. I mean, I was lucky to still be around some of my friends, but I sort of needed more opportunities to be involved in other people's work. And that gave me a lot of confidence. And I think the thing that if one thing I could have done differently, I think I made some very poor personal financial decisions around my work. I was so, you know, I had certain ideas about things we needed. I mentioned we moved into a loft together in 1992. You know, only about 4 years later, we were having trouble affording and finding a space like that again. And I put a lot of money that I was supposed to be saving into another loft that we had that lasted for 4 years. And, you know, I think if I could do that over again, I think I might have done it a little differently. I wouldn't have worried so much even then about money. Because, you know, solving our problems like that creatively was sort of what defined us. So, you know, deciding that we needed money for anything was a little bit misguided.
Yeah, my question would be, when you decide to do like verbatim show, do you think it might be a challenge or like maybe also limiting for your actors or actresses to follow like all your actors on the page?
Sorry, ask me
in
that.
a verbatim show, like when you follow all the actors, like word by word, the book. Yeah.
So like reading something like Gatsby, like
Yes,
when
yes.
you're just doing, you know, you were asked earlier, is there a script for Gatsby? And you were like, it's the book.
Yeah.
Right. So is the question more
Yes.
about when you're doing that verbatim? So then is it a question of what do the actors do?
Yes. Is it like limiting, or do you think it's like gives like enough freedom for your actors or actresses?
Yeah, I mean, it is very challenging. Of course, that's why we decided. I mean, I think I know, and my actors know, that there needs to be something challenging at the beginning. There needs to be something that. I mean, that's the kind of work we make. Is that we like to put ourselves in a difficult situation and then try to work our way out of it. So I think for my actors, while plenty of them are all of them really are very skilled at what they do, they're skilled actors, they're not interested as much in the sort of conventional acting challenge of having a text that they read and understand, and then they have to sort of translate it emotionally. So the business of there being a text like that, where it's verbatim, where we have to do every word, they enjoy the difficulty in a way. And I think part of the way we get through that is is through a kind of healthy dose of irreverence. You know, we try not to take anything too seriously in the beginning, which is not to say that we do ultimately take what we're doing very seriously, but we get into it sometimes in a very unserious way. So there's a sort of irreverence and playfulness that we bring to the early stages of work on something. So even if it's like, you know, I don't expect the actors to come up with a perfect solution when they first see that text. They play with it. They stick to the assignment that they have to do every word of it, but there's something playful early on, and that's part of how we get into it.
A professor of mine used to like the phrase enabling constraint, right? So that you have
That's
this
great.
frame, and then within that, it actually can be weirdly liberating.
Yeah.
And creatively motivating.
That's right.
Which is a great thing, but sometimes is what we call cold comfort. It's like, oh good, this is an enabling constraint, but it's hard.
But it's still a constraint.
It's really hard.
Yeah. No, I absolutely subscribe to that. I mean, that's, in a way, that's what we're always looking for early in the process, is what is going to be the constraint. What's going to be the thing we are sort of knocking up against.
Right.
And that leads to early frustration, but it causes creativity. You know, it requires it.
Did you, Abda?
As you probably know, the theatre scene in New York is pretty congested, and so it's like that in Hong Kong as well. So I'm curious, when you were building your company, what was it about it that you think makes it distinct or makes you stand out in the market?
Well, gosh. One thing at the time, working as a group the way we were was more unusual than it is now. The downtown avant-garde in New York in the late 1980s, early 1990s was a little bit more oriented toward solo performers. And there was, you know, you had monologists like Spalding Gray and Eric Bogosian, performance artists like Karen Finley, Holly Hughes, Eric Bogosian.
Yeah, but it was like the person, not that collective again, I think.
Yeah, right.
The collective was unusual.
Yeah, it was a little more unusual. And I mean, I think that, you know, we had a kind of, although what I was trying to make, in some ways, and now in some sort of embarrassing ways, I was really trying to emulate the Wooster Group. I was borrowing ideas left and right from them because I thought that gave the work some, you know, extra importance and legitimacy. But in fact, I think one of the things that made us stand out early on was there was a kind of absurdity that we embraced. It was almost a kind of vaudevillian sense of humor that the work had, and that was I think that was even more evident in the early work. So I think there was something. I think people had fun in our work. I mean, there was something kind of light about it, and that was kind of our way in. And we continue to that. Our work is still characterized by that, although it has gotten. The material we work with has gotten much more serious. I think that was one of the things that set us apart early on.
Yeah, I'm curious about what you would, when you were talking about the start of the company, and that it tracks with other conversations we've had with other visiting artists who are largely coming from a DIY aesthetic without, you know, what you termed as ambition for the company, without necessarily a career path. They just wanted to create the work. And I'm curious about that, sort of that moment of transition, which happens for lots of artists when they have a day job, but then the artistic pursuit is starting to do well, and you've got to make a decision of letting go of the safety net of the day job and pursue the company for full time, the decisions to professionalize and say, all right, we are going to take on an infrastructure. Now, we do need to have a managing director, we do need to have a producer, we need to support and office. I'm worried if you could talk a little bit about sort of that moment in the life of the company.
Well, I think one thing that was, well, first of all, it took place over a long period of time. There was not one moment of, oh, okay, now I can quit this job and I'm good to just run the company and get paid by the company. I think partly because the job that I was doing for my day job, such as it was with the Wooster Group doing sound, that I was able to sort of slowly extract myself from the Wooster Group. Like, I'm going to work on these 2 shows, but not this one. I'll come in the afternoons just for rehearsal, but I'm not going to be there in the morning for any meetings. So there was a sort of slow pulling back from that job that I was able to do, thankfully, because that was also a theater company, and there were ways to sort of have one foot out the door for a while, which I did. But it was, and then I left and worked just for ERS for a little while. Kind of went back to the Wooster Group. There was, around that time, ERS almost stopped. There was a point where we felt like we were spinning our wheels. We weren't getting new ideas. We were just feeling frustrated. We felt like we needed a break. And we could do that because we didn't have a staff. We didn't have people who depended on work being made all the time to make money for themselves. So we actually took a break, and I went back to work for the Wooster Group a little bit more regularly. But in that break, we started to work on GATS, and which turned out to be an enormous idea. At the time, it was just something we had thought of a few years before and put on the shelf, and I was restless. I wanted something to do. So I had almost gone back completely to my day job, but then that idea happened and kind of took off. And the transition to ERS becoming really a full-time company was something that the success of that show required. It wasn't something that we did so that we could make a show like that. We made that show, and then suddenly people were interested in it, and there was touring happening, and we were traveling a lot, and we realized, we need a full-time company manager, because the show is going out on the road all the time. I can't handle this by myself. And then there was some more money coming in because of that, and we needed more help managing that. So the company's transition to a full-time operation was kind of in response to demand, which I think is a good way for it to happen. I mean, it meant there were a few years where we were really, sort of struggling to catch up. But it's much better to be doing that than to be, way out over your skis and, needing to raise a lot of money to pay a staff that, and not having the work to back it up. So we've always kind of followed the work that way. But that took place between like 2003 and 2010, somewhere in that range of time. The company grew a lot, and that's when it became my real job.
And so now it is a real job,
Yeah.
quote unquote, right? Like what grown-ups have.
Yeah, I rarely do any. Yeah, it does feel a little grown up that way. We have a staff of about 7 people. We do a little more education work now. We do more workshops and working in schools, and that's part of the way it's helped sustain the company and get involved in sort of collaborative projects with other artists every now and then. I rarely do anything outside of the company. I get asked every now and then, and this coming year I will be doing some work on a project outside of the company, but that's extremely rare. So.
More sound work?
No, it's a project with the Manchester International Festival about translation.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Lindsay, did you have a question?
No, I do. I have many, but our time is.
Okay, I wasn't.
And I know people have classes,
Good.
and I noticed that none of the food we brought is eaten.
There's
so I
food?
just wanna-
Oh, right.
Wait.
This is
So-
my leave. Nobody else has got this.
No, I didn't. Lindsay mentioned it to me, but I didn't quite know. So the ideas about translation will have to wait maybe until
Yeah.
you come back in September. because we are a translation happy, indeed translation crazy.
This would be a great
and
place for
this
that
is-
project, actually.
This is the place for it.
Yeah.
All things happen. So thank you so much for your time.
welcome.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.
And
And a huge thank you to for the great moderation and everyone for attending part of the Arts Chat series.
Arts Chat series. I didn't even know we had a name.
And we did live stream this, so for friends of yours who weren't here, send it off on Facebook. It's on the Arts Center website. It now exists in the world. It's permanent, or it's permanent until everyone jumps off Facebook. And thank you, John. And it'll be on YouTube. So thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.